Thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone for coming on a cold, wet, miserable November night on a Friday. What else would you want to do but listen to a lecture? But I'm going to try and keep this short and hopefully optimistic. It's going to start a bit pessimistic, just warning you. It'll get a bit better. And yeah, hopefully we can have a nice discussion afterwards. So I thought I might just start by saying what I'm trying to say when I mean sustainable and socially just. And the way I'm going to frame it is a relatively simple heuristic diagram, but one that I think is quite nice, which is the donut economics approach, which was done by Kate Raworth. And what she said is that there's a range of different things that you need to have above a threshold for humanity to have decent well-being, and it's things like justice and education and political voice, social equity and that kind of thing. So there's a foundation below which you shouldn't be falling for humanity's well-being. But then also there's a ceiling above which you shouldn't be going if you don't want to destroy the biosphere on which we all depend. And you can see a list of things that need not to go too high above the ceiling. And so what you've got in between is what she calls the donut. It's the place where your social elements are reaching the threshold and you're not overshooting the ceiling. She also then showed where we are at the moment. There's an awful lot of red, and the red is where we're not working properly for social justice and we're overshooting on our ecological footprint. And of course, as conservationists, we work on the kind of biodiversity loss and land conversion areas mostly, but bearing in mind that all these other things are also important. They all interact in very complicated ways that are far less donut-shaped than this. So that's what I mean by sustainable and socially just, broadly speaking. Okay, so I thought, seeing as we're here in Oxford, I'd start by saying what's happened in the last 30 years or so, and there's me leaving school aged 18. So when I came up to Oxford, it was a pretty cool time to be a conservation scientist because basically the birth of what was then conservation biology happened while I was an undergraduate, and that's quite a rare thing to be able to say. So this book came out by Soule, which is the kind of foundations of conservation biology. E.O. Wilson brought out a book called Biodiversity. I distinctly remember some Oxford professor telling me that biodiversity was a fad, it was a word that would never last, and I should forget all about it in a lecture. So that's what we know. Never believe anything your lecturer tells you. So in the 30 years since I've been a conservation scientist, this is correlation and not causation. Things haven't gone terribly well. So I guess the first slide that anyone in a conservation conference tends to put up is this slide here, which is the Living Planet Index. So this is an index standardized to 1970 of number of individuals of vertebrate species, basically. So, not the best index, but what you can see here is that since I matriculated, we've lost about 40% of our vertebrate biomass. European songbirds also similar, and you could pick a range of different species groups and get similar kinds of things. Since I graduated, 9 bird species have gone extinct. We've had a first casualty to climate change, and now let's see if the speaker's working. No, I'm going to have to whistle for you then. It's a sound that goes a bit like this. And it's the sound of the Baiji, Yangtze River dolphin, declared extinct in 2006, only to be found on the internet now. So that's a virtual existence for a species, if ever I saw one. So not going so great. And so I think what we're getting at the moment, certainly around here, is the prevailing narrative of global warming. I hate putting up these rhinos with noses cut off pictures, but I did it anyway. So illegal wildlife trade, air pollution, water pollution, all these interacting things which are affecting both wildlife and humans. However, that's not to say that there hasn't been some response to this loss of biodiversity. And there's kind of on the global level, with international agreements, I guess there's 3. So 1992, the first one is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which in 2010, we had the biodiversity targets, which are slightly more concrete. expressions of what we would like biodiversity to look like. Then we had in 2015 the Sustainable Development Goals and the climate change targets set in Paris. And so we are getting international responses. And actually, as we talk now, we're on the cusp of 2020 when all these three things are going to be rethought, reviewed, renegotiated. So the biodiversity framework is going to be renegotiated in 2020 so that we have the update from the HE targets, which we got in 2010. We're going to be holding the climate change conference in Glasgow, and the Sustainable Development Goals are up for review as well. And so people are starting to think about how we've matched up over the last 10 years. And certainly on the biodiversity side, all the analyses have been pretty grim, that we're not really going to meet any of our biodiversity targets that we made in 2010. And that is because of a range of interacting drivers. And I put this up, it's a nice paper by Sean Maxwell, which says what are the listed causes of endangerment on the IUCN Red List. And what you can see here is that over-harvesting and agricultural activity are two of the really large ones, over-harvesting mostly logging. But we've got a range of other different drivers of biodiversity loss, and they interact, of course. And the other thing to think about is that they're all on different scales. So maybe you can think about it on three scales. So we've got our kind of macro level scales at the planetary level, things like climate change. We've got our meso level scales of action of these drivers at the large landscape or the national level. And then we've got the micro level drivers of biodiversity loss at the scale of the individual who's making decisions. And all of these different scales interact. And as I go through my talk, I'll be talking through the different scales. And the other thing to think about is that all of this stuff is place-based. So you've got all your drivers at different interacting scales, but they're all kind of playing out in a given place. So these are some photos that we took a couple of years ago when we went to Cambodia. This is a protected area, probably the best protected area in Cambodia. And what we've got here is encroachment by small-scale farmers, both for their own subsistence crops, but also for cash crops into the protected area. We've got a large-scale logging of dipterocarp species for export. So that's more of a meso or macro-scale driver, export into China and Vietnam. We've got bushmeat, which is a local-scale driver. People are eating stuff coming out of the forest. And again, we've got export of orchid species that is more kind of meso macro-scale driven. So in all of these different places, we've got an interacting set of drivers. So what is a conservation scientist to do? And here's some bright, young, optimistic conservation scientists standing around hoping that there's something for them to do that's going to make a difference. And so I'm going to give a couple of illustrations now from work that we've been doing in our group, which I think illustrates the way in which I think we as conservationists can respond to this in a way that can give us some optimism. The first one I'm going to talk about is some work that was led by Henry Travers that was done in Uganda. We just finished it a couple of years ago, trying to reduce illegal behaviour. And these are in the two iconic national parks that Uganda has, Murchison Falls National Park and Queen Elizabeth National Park. That is where all the tourists go and where most of their big game are. This work was done in collaboration, very importantly, with the Uganda Wildlife Authority, which is the government authority that is in charge of the national parks. So I guess one of the things is that you have to do this stuff in collaboration with government authorities. It was also done with a couple of partners, WCS in Uganda and IAD, which is an environmental think tank. So the problem in this case was that there was concern by the Wildlife Authority about large-scale poaching inside these national parks. And certainly for the things like elephant poaching, there's a macro-scale driver of the illegal wildlife trade for demand elsewhere in Asia. What we also have in these national parks is quite strong meso-scale drivers, and some of that is about poverty and lack of livelihood opportunities for the people living around those areas, but it's also interlinked with the response to that poaching. So very high level of militarisation, lots of law enforcement going to those parks, and strong negative interactions between the local people and those anti-poaching patrols that are going in there. I'll talk about that more later. And then finally we have our micro-level drivers, and that's mostly about individual households trading off in their livelihoods as to whether they're going to invest in farming or whether they're going to invest in bushmeat hunting and how they're going to do that. Okay, so talking a little bit more about this militarisation thing. So in these areas in Uganda, what you have around the national parks is something called revenue sharing, which is when a proportion of the tourist revenues from the park goes towards the local communities. And that is supposed to be used for community level projects, and that's supposed to be their compensation for the fact that they have a national park that means they don't have access to natural resources. Picture at the top is a family who are protecting their crops from crop raiding animals, and therefore the children are not going to school. Those are people who should be getting compensation. And then the bottom slide is people graduating out of the wildlife colleges. So we have very large numbers of people being trained as law enforcement officials. So what we have, for example, in Murchison Falls National Park, which is where a lot of the elephant poaching happens, is that we have 200 law enforcement guards on the payroll, and we have 6 community rangers on the payroll, who are the people who are trying to deal with human-wildlife conflict and relationships with local people. And so there's a track record of mistrust, failed projects where both the Wildlife Authority and poachers are not keeping their side of the bargain, and everyone not liking each other. So the way we came in was to try to do our research in a kind of adaptive management way. So trying to investigate the attitudes and the prevalence of illegal wildlife behaviours using large-scale household socioeconomic surveys, so more than 2,000 people we questioned. We also then did some behavioural economics to try to understand what kinds of interventions people preferred. So using choice experiments to understand the kind of range of attributes that a local person would want from a better intervention that would try to reduce their hunting, and then also trying to understand what the rangers' perspectives were of what would work and what wouldn't, and then using that information to help the Wildlife Authority to adapt and to design new interventions. The first question is, how much illegal activity is there actually around these national parks? Because there's concern, but there wasn't a prevalence estimate. So this was work that was done using something called the unmatched count technique, which is an indirect questioning technique. So that means that you can ask them questions without them having to reveal directly whether they've actually done something or not. You randomise in order to hide their responses. So it means that you get better, more accurate estimates of what's being done. So this is in the last 12 months. What proportion of households have done various illegal things, and you can see that 42% of households in this survey around these national parks had hunted wildlife for sale inside protected areas, which is pretty massive and was the major illegal use of wildlife or illegal activity in these areas. And then there's others, perhaps less severe and less prevalent. What you can do also is then you can spatially locate those people. You can't do it by village because that would lead to issues with anonymity. But you can see here, the red provinces are areas where there's more commercial hunting. So you can start to see about where you might want to target your interventions if you wanted to have most impact. Then, based upon the statistical analysis of the results, we were able to find out who was more likely to hunt illegally and why that was. And our original thought was that poorer households would hunt because they were hunting in order to get a livelihood. And that proved not to be true. Actually, it was the better off households that were hunting. And the problem there is that you can't get an understanding of cause and effect. So they could be hunting more because they're better off and therefore they have the gear or they have the ability to go hunting, or they could be better off because they're hunting. And from kind of digging a little bit deeper, it seemed that it was both, probably. The other people who were more likely to hunt illegally were the ones who were living right next to the park and were suffering costs from the park. So they were suffering crop raiding or livestock predation, depending on where they were. And the other ones, you remember I told you about benefit sharing and how it was going to the community. Of course, there was a lot of elite capture, a lot of failure to trickle down to the households that actually needed it. And so the households that felt that they were not benefiting from this benefits transfer were least happy. So that's in terms of the statistical analysis. But then What we also did was Henry went into prisons and into reformed poachers associations and talked directly to the poachers, and kind of a fairly consistent view came out, which kind of mentioned there, which is actually they hunt because it's a way to get money. They hunt because it's an easy way to get money. There's no obvious other way of getting cash. And so there was just this basic thing of, actually, if you want us not to hunt, we need to have some other way to get cash. So some of it was about resentment, some of it was about feeling that they have losses from the national park, but some of it was also just about, this is a way to get cash. The next thing comes from the choice experiments I told you about, which was about which approaches going forward are preferred by people. So we chose approaches that the Uganda Wildlife Authority said might be sensible or that have been tried elsewhere. So things like investing more in mitigating human-wildlife conflicts. So not giving them extra money, but the money that was supposed to be going to them anyway, directing it more into human-wildlife conflict. So this is a picture of people digging a trench against elephants around some fields in the Murchison Falls. The next type of thing is social enterprises. So this is when you're giving people things like beekeeping or sustainable intensification of their crops. You're training them and supporting them to improve their livelihoods. The third one is eco-guards, and this is where you employ local community members to act as the liaison between the Wildlife Authority and the local communities. They'd report human-wildlife conflict. They might chase away animals that were causing conflict. But it was a way of getting a few people employed and also improving relationships. Legal hunting was one that we stuck in against the advice of the Wildlife Authority. So we thought, in the buffer zones, people are allowed to hunt to get honey, wild honey. They're allowed to get fuel wood, and they're allowed to cut certain amounts of trees in the buffer zones, but they're not allowed to hunt legally. So we thought naively from Oxford, oh well, you know, if they want meat, then why can't we talk about maybe having a bit of legal hunting in the buffer zone of things that are sustainable? And then the last one was law enforcement. So what's the role of law enforcement? And so what I've done here is 2 ticks mean they really like it, and from the locals, this is the result of a choice experiment. From the Wildlife Authority, it's the results of focus groups. 1 tick is they like it a bit, and a cross is they don't. So what you can see is that we were wrong, basically. Nobody liked legal hunting, and interestingly, you know, they liked all the kind of social stuff. Interestingly, the local people didn't dislike law enforcement. Actually, they understood that this was a natural asset, the protected area, and that they wanted it preserved. But they also wanted other stuff as well. Another really important thing for sustainability is that things are fair. So nothing is going to last and nothing's going to be accepted unless it's seen to be fair. And as you can see, the 3 kind of social enterprisey type things all seem to be fair. Legal hunting they were a bit ambiguous about it. Now we're getting on to the more pertinent questions about behaviour change. So one element of behaviour change is cooperating with the Wildlife Authority and telling them about people who are doing hunting. And basically they all potentially would have improved that cooperation. And here's the $64,000 question, which is which approaches might reduce your illegal hunting. And you can see that legal hunting was not going to reduce their illegal hunting, but all the other things were. Although interestingly, mitigating human-wildlife conflicts, which was reducing the cost felt by people who were going to hunt, wasn't seen to be that effective. Okay, so that was the research, and we presented all this broad range of research. But this next bit is where we start to feel more proud of ourselves, I guess. So I said that the Uganda Wildlife Authority were a partner. So what we did then was we helped them to write action plans for both of the parks, and the 3 pillars that they decided to have for the action plans for combating wildlife crime, where they decided they need to have effective relationships with local people, effective law enforcement, and positive incentives. And so they wrote these action plans based upon that, which were costed, prioritised things that they were going to do, and how they were going to actually implement their budget going forward to do that. It was written by or with us, with a forward by the executive director. And this picture here is the kind of wrap-up the presentation meeting, and the guy is the executive director of the Wildlife Authority, and he's handing that document to the head of the community wildlife rangers for Murchison Falls National Park, giving her kind of go ahead and implement this. So that was pretty good, and we subsequently had another project that I was less involved in that involved working with the Wildlife Authority and the NGOs to actually implement some of these things. So in this case, going back to the kind of scales of the drivers, what we had was detailed research by our team at the kind of micro scale level, trying to understand what motivated households, which then allowed us to engage with UA, the Wildlife Authority, to try to change their behaviour. And what the thing was that the reason why we were able to get that circle was that we were able to give them the evidence that allowed them to be brave. So if you imagine you've got a budget as a wildlife authority, as a protected area manager, and your budget is currently mostly spent on rangers and law enforcement, it's a very courageous thing to change that budget to be more about communities, more about kind of the softly stuff. Because if you do that and then someone poaches an elephant, then the immediate response potentially from your international donors and from higher up in your government is, look guys, you took away money from the guards and look what happened, an elephant died. And so being able to say, but we've got research that shows that this is going to be effective and it's going to actually lead to a reduction in poaching, allowed them to be able to do that. We can't, from what we've done, affect the macro level drivers. That needs to be done by demand side reductions far away in Asia. Okay, so that's the first example. The second example I'm going to tell you about is it's slightly different. It's still in Uganda as it happens, but this is about infrastructure. So this is about the fact that large-scale infrastructure happens, national development happens, economic development is a fact of life. But how do we make that economic development something that works for local people and that works for nature? And how do you make your biodiversity impact mitigation strategies more locally effective? So I'm going to start this case study with probably my favourite, I'm not sure if favourite is the right word, most impactful statement that someone has said to me in the last couple of years, which is 70% of the infrastructure that will be on the planet in 2050 has not yet been built. So if you think about that, that's quite scary. A lot of that is to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, which is a massive kind of infrastructure development process, but not all of it. So how can we, as conservationists, as sustainability scientists, work to make sure that that infrastructure, as it gets built, is built in a way that is good for local people and that is good for, well, maybe not good, but at least not bad for nature, not as bad for nature. And I guess we have a little window right now in which we can start to influence. And one way in which we can influence, which is certainly the way in which we did this in Uganda, is to try to help national governments to get legislation in place so that at least when the infrastructure comes, they have the appropriate legislation that means that they are able to respond to that infrastructure. So let me tell you the story of what happened. So in this case, it was a dam in Uganda. It was a dam on the Nile River, and we went in to look at that. So I guess the first kind of broader thing is to think about the fact that there are inevitable trade-offs, which I've sort of mentioned already. That, you know, you have your national level development priorities. In the case of Uganda, this dam was for national level electricity generation in a country where there's just a massive lack of rural electrification. And rural electrification is needed for education, it's needed for all sorts of development things that mean that people are brought out of poverty. So that's really important. And that is often traded off against local, national, and global biodiversity values. And we often come in as global biodiversity scientists saying, you can't build it here or whatever, on the basis of the global value for biodiversity. So those two things quite often trade off in discourse. But what we don't get so much of is the local people's needs and aspirations. That doesn't always trickle into the larger scale discourse. So the way in which biodiversity is accounted for in these big projects is something called the mitigation hierarchy. And often it's got a target of no net loss of biodiversity, and that target is often mandated. So any time you have to borrow from an international institution like the World Bank or the IFC, you have to commit to no net loss of biodiversity. Many countries, an increasingly large number of countries, are committing to, in legislation, no net loss of biodiversity. The UK has been teetering on the brink of no net loss for a few years now. Not there yet, but maybe if we get the Environment Act, then we will. So, so it's something that's more and more done. The idea of the mitigation hierarchy is that you have some kind of expectation of the biodiversity damage that will be done by your bit of infrastructure. Then you try to remediate or to compensate for that in various ways to try and make sure that your biodiversity is back to where it was. The first thing you can do is avoid areas of particular biodiversity value. So don't build it on a national park. Try to get your road going around things. So that will take you so far. That will take you to some of the biodiversity loss being avoided. The next thing you can do is when you're actually doing your infrastructure, you can minimise the damage that you're doing. So you can try to do it in an environmentally sensitive way. You can try to make sure that your big constructions happen when it's outside the breeding season for whatever species you're concerned about. So those two are both preventative measures. There'll still be some damage. Then you have to go into compensation. So you can try to remediate your area. You can restore the area around where you're doing it to get you some way. That will still not do it. So then the last thing you have to do is offset once you've been through everything else. And that means improving conservation value of biodiversity elsewhere. And then that's compensatory. And then if you offset over your damage, then that's net gain, but otherwise it's no net loss. So that's what people do. So, for example, if you have a housing development, you can go through the mitigation hierarchy. And the problem with that is that that's a big focus on the kind of broad biodiversity stuff, and it doesn't tell you the heterogeneity of who actually gains and loses from all this stuff. There's an issue on the biodiversity side, but there's also an issue on the social side. So with your housing development, you might have some people gaining from the housing and other people gaining from the fact that there's a biodiversity offset nearby, and so they now have a nice flower meadow to walk in. But often they're not the people who've lost out. People who've lost out might be the people who used that open space for football or for dog walking, and now they can't. And it might also be more subtle than that. It might be local residents who've seen that their way of life is changing. So you have to think about all those different people who are gaining and losing. Okay, so that takes me on to my example. So this was done by Victoria Griffiths for her PhD, again in Uganda, again with the national government authority. In this case, it was the National Environmental Management Authority, NEMA. And so they're the ones who are in charge of overseeing the environmental work that's done to remediate infrastructure. And they're the ones who oversee, environmental impact assessments and things like that. We also had local NGOs, so Nature Uganda, WCS Uganda again, a little consultancy, Wild Business, and IIED. So interestingly, we chose this project and this particular case study because NEMA asked us to, basically. So they are the authority who are supposed to be making sure that the environmental compensation is done, and they were the ones who suggested we came in and did that, and that will become interesting later. So it was a dam. It was just kind of north of Ginger on the Nile, and basically what it was the Bujagali hydropower project. So this was a big dam that was completed in 2012. It was predominantly World Bank funded, and that meant that required environmental and social safeguards. It also required no net loss of biodiversity, proper compensation of local people, because that's what the World Bank allegedly wants. So one of the things that it did was it kind of destroyed some riparian areas, but it also flooded the Bujagali Falls. That was one of the big things. That is a spiritual site for local people. It's a site of great cultural heritage that was not a good thing to flood. There was a 200-page sustainable management plan for the biodiversity offset that was put in place as a condition of the World Bank funding, and it's called the Kalagala offset. So what that did was protect some other falls called Kalagala Falls as kind of compensation for the heritage lost from the Bujagali Falls, and to develop tourism activities there to compensate for the tourism activities that were lost elsewhere, and to conserve a nearby forest reserve, which is somewhere which was important both for biodiversity and for local livelihoods. Interestingly, after that, and kind of as our project started really, another dam started to be constructed called the Asimba Dam. It was a bit further up, and that was done not by the World Bank, and therefore it was not required to have no net loss or net gain. It was funded by the Chinese government, and it actually did have some potential impacts on the offset that was supposed to be permanent and forever by flooding a little bit of the offset. So that was an interesting extra context to what we were doing. Okay, so I'm not going to go into great detail. We did a whole lot of biodiversity analysis to see how the biodiversity changed over the 10 years since the offset was supposed to have been put in place. This is just a brief look at the kind of well-being social aspects. So what we've got here is the Nile River flowing up from Lake Victoria, and what Victoria did was she looked at 6 villages along the Nile River. So the first 2 either side of the river, first 2 were in the Bujagali area, so that was near the dam. The second 2 either side of the river were in the Kalagala area, that's where the biodiversity offset was meant to happen, and the third 2 are in the area of the Chinese-funded dam, the Isimba Dam further up. And we looked at well-being changes on 3 different dimensions: land, income and food. Don't worry about it really. The thing to think about is the colour schemes. Just the kind of unfocused broad picture is the thing to see. So what we've got here is green means they didn't see any impact on their well-being of the dam and the offset. Orange means that they felt a negative impact, and blue, if you can see it, tiny little things on the income bit, is where they gained. And so some people gained from a little bit of compensation that was given to them for the loss of their farmland. So what you can see here is the people in the dam area is basically mostly lost. The people in the offset area, basically nothing happened. And yeah, that's the story really. That's the quantitative story. It's always interesting to think about the qualitative story as well. So these are just some indicative quotes of many that give some feel for the way in which people lost or gained. So a lot of people, the top one is very, very typical. That's what most people said. You know, their livelihoods were destroyed. They lost their farmland, they lost their fishing, they lost their income from tourism, a range of different livelihood activities. There were also quite a number of people who mentioned the loss of the spiritual sites. So what happened was that as compensation, the company removed the spirits from the Bujagali site before it was flooded. They took them somewhere else and then they placed them somewhere else, which some people in the village said that that was okay, and other people in the village said that that really wasn't okay. And this is an example of someone who said it wasn't. There were also kind of interesting things that were more relational and more social. So not about your individual livelihoods, but were about how you related to people. So people feeling hoodwinked. There was a lot of conflict. There was a lot of conflict between couples, interestingly. There was a lot of conflict between neighbours. There was a lot of loss of social structures. Neighbours moved away because their farm had been flooded. And there was a lot of resentment. So that kind of thing was also important. The few people who said that there were positives were mostly about the compensation. So individual positivity was about the compensation, but there were some people who also recognised the national importance of electrification, who said, well, you know, it might not have been so great for me, but I recognise that Uganda as a country needs to develop, and maybe when there's electrification that will support the development of the country, and that will support me indirectly. So there were some people who said that. The next thing we looked at was, okay, so basically short answer to what effect the offset had had on both the biological and social side was basically nothing. Most of the things that they promised in their 200-page document hadn't been done. In fact, pretty much all of them hadn't been done in 10 years. So what we did was we took a few examples of the main things that were supposed to have happened in the offset, and we asked local people, you know, if you were to have an offset, what would you like to have? And again, it was a choice experiment supplemented by qualitative interviews. And these are the top 3 in order of the things that they said. So the first thing they said was they wanted the money to be invested in the central forest reserves to make them better for people and for wildlife. They wanted investment in community development. And they also liked the idea of tree planting to replace the riparian trees that had been lost. We also asked them about individual level stuff, individual level compensation, individual level employment. People didn't really want that. So people were much more interested in the communal benefits than in the individual benefits. So that was something that we were able to say, you know, these, if you're going to do this offset again, if you're going to try and make it better, how about doing these things? Okay, so it was interesting. Like I said, never asked us in. It was really interesting to think, why would the environmental authority that had overseen the non-implementation of a sustainable management plan for which in principle there was some money, or no one seemed to know where the money was. Why did they bring us in? And interestingly, during the time that we were doing this, the World Bank decided they were going to refinance the dam, give a load of extra money, and that part of that was going to be potentially for improving the offset or extending the offset. Massive criticism ensued. They did actually refinance the dam. I'm being recorded, but I don't care because it really annoyed me. We tried to contact the World Bank right the way through this project, from the point at which we submitted the proposal. Every single time we had an output, every 6 months, we contacted the guy in the World Bank who was responsible for this. And I know he was contacted. In fact, I know his door was knocked upon because 2 of my friends in the World Bank actually went and knocked on his door personally. Never got any response. And within the Uganda government, it was quite challenging because, of course, they were in sensitive negotiations with the World Bank, and so it was very difficult for people there to actually say anything very much about what we were doing. But what we did manage to do was that as the refinancing happened, our local partners in Nature Uganda were able to write a letter to the consultation that pointed these people towards our recommendations and said, we've done this research with Oxford University, here's what you should do, here's what the local people think, here's all the damage that has been done, here's how you could do it better. So that was submitted, as you can see, towards the end of August, with no obvious outcome as yet. So on the local level, I would say that this particular piece of research at the moment, there's no evidence that we're going to have any particular impact on those people trying to make things better. But what we did do as part of this project was masses and masses and masses of engagement at the national level. So part of why we were brought in was because people didn't know NGOs and government officials didn't know how to respond to no net loss. They didn't really know what it meant. They didn't know how to do the metrics. They didn't really know how to move forward. And so we had a ton of national level workshops with consultants, with government officials and with NGOs to talk through what no net loss meant, what social impacts of offsetting can be and how to improve them. And that went really, really well. The other thing that we're super proud of is this, which is the long-awaited Uganda National Biodiversity Offset Strategy that says about the fact that from now on any infrastructure in Uganda should have a no net loss requirement, and that there should be offsetting. And what we did was we got the word social into that bit of legislation, so that people now have to think about how local people are using these resources and how you're not going to damage local people's relationship with their environment as you move forward. So that's pretty exciting. And hopefully, even though we didn't manage to do anything very much for this particular piece of infrastructure, there's a lot of other infrastructure coming up. And Julia Baker from Balfour Beatty, who was the one who did most of this work, is still in consultation with people in Uganda about how to make things better the next time. We also did a load of guidelines for international use, which are being quite influential about trying to understand how to make sure that biodiversity and people are taken into account as you do these infrastructure things. So in this case, I would say we did detailed research. It didn't really lead to anything very much on the ground, maybe indirectly, maybe in the longer term it will, but it did lead to quite a lot of engagement at the national and international levels. Okay, so 2 case studies, and I guess what I think we're learning from this is that as a conservation academic or sustainability academic, you need to do this detailed bottom-up understanding of the system, and that can be really helpful for your government partners, and it can be really helpful for other people to be able to say that this has been done. But you need to keep that bigger picture in mind, so you need to keep the kind of what is the real world issue we're trying to address, what is the academic issue we're trying to address. And at the same time, in a perpendicular way, you have to try and find ways to engage and collaborate with all the stakeholders who might want to use your stuff, and you also have to have an eye on the opportunities. So I think with the dam project, we basically failed on one of the major outcomes indicators on the grant, but I don't think it was a failure because I think we had all sorts of other things that we were able to do that we could never have expected. So I guess just to think about what it is to be a conservation scientist working in this thing. So we're really lucky. We're in such a privileged position in academia because we have the opportunity to be kind of honest brokers, to be an independent voice who can give the data and the information in a way that is a way kind of separate slightly from the fray. So I think that is important, because certainly I think the reason why NEMA brought us in was that they were not able to say some of the things that they wanted to say about the dam. We were able to come in and say those things. When we did the poaching thing, we were able to come in and give the information that would allow the Wildlife Authority to make those difficult decisions based upon independent monitoring. And the other thing that we can do is that we can kind of engage with those stakeholders, and we can make sure that what we're doing is something that's relevant and that gives local people a voice. So what we were able to do in the dam example is, and actually in the National Parks one, is translate the ways in which local people were feeling about things into language and into the kind of echelons of people who could actually make a difference to what those local people were enduring. The other thing you can do then is that if you're around for long enough, you can give technical advice, and you can start to kind of put your work out into international forums to make things a little bit better. These are random cycle examples, by the way, and the reason is that this is the species that I've been working on for 29 years, and this is the place where I feel like I have been able to fulfill all those roles as an academic. So I think that means that we, as academics, have this really great platform on which we can do these things. And so, as we move into 2020, and we're moving into this super year, and everyone's getting very, very frayed, and anyone who's got anything to do with any of these conventions is really feeling the pressure over the next 6 months. We're starting to think about, can we have a global deal for nature and people that brings in some of these insights that we've been talking about, that brings in some of these ways in which we think about how development, biodiversity and people interact. Can we, as academics, I guess, bring our expertise into this? And I hope that we can, and I guess I hope also that we can move away from thinking that we're walking through treacle. So often when you're doing these kind of bits of work, you feel like you're not really having an impact. You know, this big infrastructure tsunami, and we're making really very little difference to one dam in Uganda. But I think we have to think about the fact that we're incrementally changing the way that society is thinking. And this is one of my favourite graphs, so I show it often, which just shows how, as you think you're making no headway at all, as a scientist, as someone working in a field, suddenly things can change. So what this is the number of states that have adopted into legislation socially liberal policies over 17 something? I can't really read without glasses. From the 18th century to now, basically. And you can see what you get is that you get nothing for years, and then you get a sudden switch, and all the states adopt it. And that's because the social norm has changed, and so legislators feel able to put that legislation forward. So as we're doing our science, as we're doing our research, as we're kind of feeding into the social conversation, we're gradually helping, hopefully, to shift along that line to the point at which the change happens. So who'd have thought a year ago, when we had one child sitting outside a building in Sweden, that only a year later we'd get this. So these are climate strikes in Afghanistan. You'd have thought they'd have other things to worry about, but no, they were out. India, New York, New Zealand, and South Africa. So I think that we are getting to the point at which that tipping point is changing, and that's when we, as sustainability scientists, are needed more than ever. We're needed more than ever to provide that independent advice, to provide that context, and to act as that kind of broker between the different stakeholder groups. So that's partly why I founded Conservation Optimism. Conservation Optimism is a movement that is trying to help people working in conservation to feel like they're not alone, help them to network, help them to disseminate their successes, learn from their failures, and produce something that's more than the sum of each of the little parts of all the work that we're doing around the world. And here's some just examples of some nice things that people have said about why they're conservation optimists. The other thing that I think is important and that we have to remember is that it's not just about us as conservation. If we're going to make a difference, everyone has to be involved. The whole of society has to be involved. So I also am quite keen on the hashtag I am a conservationist and making sure that everyone in society feels that they're part of this. And that's what, I think the current mood is starting to move us towards. These are members of my family who had their arms twisted. The point being that you can be a solicitor or an engineer. He's not thrilled to be wearing his hard hat, I don't think, but, or whatever you are, and you can be part of this. And And so you can also even take the mitigation hierarchy that I told you about earlier, that we use for infrastructure, that we use for other kinds of industrial impact, and think about it as something that we could do each as an individual. So just as we avoid putting our railway across Saiga habitat, we can refrain from having plastic bottles or whatever. We can minimise, reduce. We can restore, that's remediate. I don't really like redeem, it doesn't really work for offset, but if you say offset, the public will be unhappy. So if anyone can think of something beginning with R that sounds better, let me know. And here's the coordinator of conservation optimism coming in just as my last slide says, let's be optimistic. Thank you.